Picture this. A powerful judge, known and feared, is handcuffed on her own doorstep, only to uncover a conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone could imagine. What secrets lie behind the badge, and how far will one woman go to shatter the silence? Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The early light over Savannah was a lie. The delicate glow, spilling across cobblestone streets and polished brass balconies, suggested a city at peace, a city stretching awake to embrace another ordinary day. But peace was a facade, and as dawn crept across Forsyth Park, the truth began to crack through the veneer. The woman at the heart of this fracture was not what she appeared, though anyone seeing her that morning might have been fooled. Justice Eleanor Pierce, a name that carried the weight of decades in South Georgia's legal corridors, was known for her stern judgments and a voice that could silence a courtroom with a single syllable. Her reputation, brilliant, uncompromising, perhaps a touch too rigid, had made her a fixture of respect and fear in equal measure. But beneath the tailored charcoal suit and the understated string of pearls beneath the sharp, analytical mind and the clipped sentences, there was something more, a secret that not even the badge-toting officers who would arrest her that morning could have imagined. It was precisely 7:30 when the first patrol car pulled to the curb outside Eleanor's modest brick home. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the sleepy street as though expecting trouble. They hadn't been dispatched for violence or even a crime worth noting. It was a quiet warrant, a procedural sweep, tied to an investigation of a graffiti incident on a courthouse wall. But their posture betrayed their real purpose, a routine that had become all too familiar. A black woman walking down her own steps with a briefcase in hand became their justification. And when they saw Eleanor, tall, composed, radiating the quiet authority of someone who'd never been questioned, they assumed they had found their quarry. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside." The younger of the two officers said, his voice clipped but uncertain. His partner, older, with a face like weathered granite, gave a short nod of affirmation. Eleanor's lips barely parted. "Is there a reason you're obstructing me from entering my car, officer?" The younger one shifted, glancing at his partner for confirmation. "We have a warrant. You match the description. We need to detain you for questioning." She raised a single eyebrow. A description of what precisely a suspect involved in defacing courthouse property. Black female, mid-60s, short hair. The older officer interjected, his hand hovering near his belt. His tone suggested he expected compliance, not a debate. Eleanor's heartbeat did not quicken. Her voice did not rise. She did not flash her badge, though she could have. She did not correct them, though her name was etched above the very courthouse doors they claimed were defaced. Instead, she stepped forward, her shadow long in the morning light. "Do you know who I am?" A beat of silence, just long enough for the younger officer to hesitate. But protocol or prejudice overrode instinct. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll need to come with us." The words were not shouted, but they struck harder than any command. Eleanor's neighbors began to emerge from their porches, bathrobes clutched tightly, coffee cups forgotten. Someone whispered, "Isn't that Judge Pierce?" Another murmured, "What's going on?" Still Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not protest. Instead, she nodded once a movement so subtle it could have been mistaken for acquiescence or disdain. "Very well," she said quietly. "Let's not make a scene." But a scene was inevitable. Because as the officers guided her toward the squad car, handcuffs gleaming cold against her wrists, the illusion of control began to dissolve. Cameras emerged, neighbors with smartphones, a passerby with a professional lens. Whispers turned to exclamations. Judge Pierce. That's Judge Pierce. Inside the car, Eleanor sat rigid, her gaze locked on the horizon beyond the windshield. The officers fumbled with their radios, their confidence faltering. The moment was spinning out of control, faster than they could comprehend. But the true crack in their composure came not from the crowd, not from the gathering murmurs of outrage, but from the call that came through their radio. "This is dispatch. Repeat, this is dispatch. You have the wrong suspect. Release the detainee immediately." The younger officer's face drained of color. The older one's jaw clenched. Eleanor said nothing. The silence between them was thicker than the humid Georgia air. Then a thin, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't triumph. It was the smile of someone who had seen this pattern before, who had lived the script of suspicion and overreach for longer than her accusers could fathom. They knew now. But it was too late. The damage was done. By the time the car door clicked open and Eleanor stepped back onto the street, the crowd had doubled. Phones were raised. Live feeds were broadcasting. Reporters were already calling in tips to local stations. And in the chaos, Eleanor did not rush. She straightened her jacket, adjusted her glasses, and turned to face the cameras. Her voice when it came was quiet, but it resonated with a gravity that no microphone could contain. "This is not just a mistake," she said evenly. "This is a pattern, and it ends today." And as her words echoed across the street, a silent tremor passed through the officers, through the crowd, through the watching city itself. This wasn't the arrest of a graffiti suspect. This was the fracture of a facade, the spark of something far greater. Savannah's quiet morning was over. The reckoning had begun. The sun had risen higher over Savannah, but its glow did little to warm the bitter undercurrent that now rippled through its polished streets. The arrest of Justice Eleanor Pierce had already begun to take on a life of its own. By noon, it was no longer confined to scattered cell phone footage or breathless social media posts. It had crossed into the realm of broadcast news headlines, scrolling across television screens. In offices, restaurants, and homes, Savannah's esteemed judge, arrested in mistaken identity case. But behind the sterile words and dispassionate anchors, something darker was gathering momentum. Eleanor sat alone in her office. The door closed against the murmur of voices in the hallway. Her release had been swift, but it had not come without cost. The humiliation was public now, and though no formal charges were filed, the damage to her dignity and authority was undeniable. Yet she sat composed, as ever, in the worn leather chair that had borne witness to decades of rulings, decisions, and quiet triumphs. On her desk lay a manila folder, thick with papers, marked confidential, and secured with a red string. It wasn't hers. It had been slid into her hands during her release by a young officer whose eyes had been full of quiet apology. "You didn't see this from me," he'd murmured, before disappearing into the crush of the gathering press. Now, alone, Eleanor opened it. Inside were memos, complaints, internal investigation reports, pages heavy with the weight of suppressed truths. They chronicled incidents of misconduct, allegations of corruption, whispers of cover-ups within the police department. Names she recognized appeared repeatedly, officers she had seen testify in her courtroom cases she had presided over, where evidence had mysteriously vanished, where victims had been too frightened or too exhausted to fight. But these weren't just scattered incidents. They formed a pattern hidden beneath the city's genteel exterior. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The stories they told weren't new to her. She'd always known the undercurrents were there. But the scope, the systemic nature, the names, it was staggering. She felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. Yet something had shifted. The arrest, the humiliation, those things had peeled away a layer of distance she'd once maintained. Now she wasn't just a judge peering down from the bench. She was a victim, an unwilling participant in the very machine she had trusted to deliver justice. The knock at her door was soft, hesitant. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. It was Marcus, her longtime clerk. His face was pale, his usually meticulous tie askew. "Judge Pierce, I think you should see this." He handed her a tablet. The screen displayed a live feed from a local news outlet. The footage showed a group of officers gathered in a dimly lit back room. Surveillance perhaps leaked. Their voices were low, urgent, but the captions revealed enough. They were discussing her arrest, not as a mistake, but as part of a broader plan. Words like containment, damage control, and pressure points flashed on the screen. One voice, deep and commanding, said, "She wasn't supposed to walk away clean." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but her face remained a mask. When was this recorded? "About 30 minutes ago," Marcus said. "Someone leaked it to the station anonymously. They're calling it a scandal. It's already gone viral." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. The shadows she had glimpsed in the manila folder were already beginning to take form, to speak. They were no longer whispers behind closed doors. They were confessions caught on camera, carried on airwaves. She opened her eyes and met Marcus's gaze. "Find out who sent this, quietly, and lock down everything we have on cases tied to these officers. I want a complete review. Every complaint, every irregularity, every missing file." Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure, Judge, this could get dangerous?" She straightened in her chair, her voice firm. "It's already dangerous, Marcus. But we can't stop now." As he left, she sat back, staring at the folder on her desk. The weight of it was almost crushing, but it wasn't just paper. It was the map of a system's rot, and for the first time, she realized it wasn't enough to merely point it out from the safety of the bench. It had to be confronted. Her thoughts were interrupted by her phone buzzing insistently. The caller ID was blocked. She answered anyway. "Judge Pierce," a low, gravelly voice said. "This is a warning. Stop digging. This isn't your fight." Her throat tightened, but her tone didn't waver. "I beg to differ. You're already on thin ice," the voice continued. "You go public with what you think you know, and you won't just be disbarred. You'll disappear." The call disconnected. Eleanor stared at the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She wasn't afraid for herself. That part of her had been burned away the moment they'd clicked the cuffs around her wrists. But the threat made her chest tighten with a cold dread. It wasn't just about her. It was about the integrity of a system she'd believed in, the safety of those she cared about, the future of justice in her city. She stood gathering the contents of the folder and sliding them into her briefcase. The day was far from over, and the shadows were deepening. But if there was one thing she had learned in her decades on the bench, It was that darkness was only temporary. And when truth finally surfaced, when the shadows whispered their secrets aloud, it was no longer darkness. It was the beginning of dawn. Eleanor Pierce wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The air in Savannah thickened with the weight of secrets and whispers, like a storm swelling at sea just beyond the horizon. By the time the sun had dipped low behind the spires and cobblestones of the historic district, Eleanor Pierce was no longer just a judge, quietly piecing together fragments of corruption. She had become something else entirely, an unexpected fulcrum upon which a city's balance of power now teetered. Inside the old courthouse, she sat at a heavy oak table, strewn with papers, documents marked with hasty red annotations, and thumb drives glowing faintly under the soft lamplight. Marcus stood near the window, peering out between the heavy drapes. "The reporters are multiplying," he said quietly, not looking back at her. "They're circling the building, waiting for any sign of you." Eleanor didn't glance up from the file she was studying. "Let them wait." Marcus turned his voice low and urgent. "Judge Pierce, they're saying the department is scrambling. Command staff meetings late into the night, phones ringing nonstop. And now there are rumors of a sealed grand jury convening quietly downtown." Eleanor's pen paused in midair. A grand jury. "Already they're moving fast," Marcus confirmed. "Trying to cut this off before it spreads." A cold weight settled in her chest. She had seen this playbook before silence the dissenter bury the evidence deflect with bureaucracy. But the difference now was that she was not the judge presiding over someone else's fate, she was the target. And this wasn't just about her. It was about every voice that had been silenced before hers, every injustice neatly folded away beneath procedural excuses. She pushed the papers aside and rose from her chair, walking slowly to the window. The streetlights outside flickered like hesitant beacons, illuminating pockets of protesters and journalists. Some held signs bearing slogans of justice and accountability. Others simply stood with phones raised, capturing the quiet tension that had gripped the city. "They want a spectacle," Eleanor murmured, "but not the one they expect." Before Marcus could reply, her phone rang. She picked it up, recognizing the number as Agent Rosalind Keene from the Department of Justice. "Keene," she said, her voice steady. "Judge Pierce, we've got a problem." Keene's voice crackled through the line. "One of our confidential informants inside the department has just been compromised. Their cover's blown. And word is someone high up has greenlit a sweep of any evidence tied to corruption, digital, physical, everything. If we don't move fast, everything disappears." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to get out of the courthouse," Keene said. "There's talk of a lockdown under the pretense of security. If they seal you in, we lose the testimony and the documents you've got. And worse, you disappear into the system." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I'm not running." Keene's voice softened but remained urgent. "This isn't about running. It's about staying ahead. We need your voice, your files, your testimony. You're not just a witness. You're the thread holding this entire case together." For a moment, Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years spent believing in a system now teetering on the edge of collapse. She thought of the young officer who had slipped her the folder of the family she had seen crumple in grief over lost cases of the whispered threats and the quiet fury that had simmered beneath Savannah's genteel facade for far too long. "I'll meet you," she said finally. Where Keene hesitated, The old ferry terminal under the pretext of a private meeting with federal agents. We'll get you into secure custody and move the evidence to a safe location. But you have to leave now. Eleanor nodded, though Keene couldn't see her. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up and turned to Marcus. Get the car. Quietly. We're leaving through the side exit. They moved with practiced efficiency, slipping through back corridors and service entrances known only to long-serving staff. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly in the deserted hallways. As they emerged into the night, the air smelled faintly of rain and ozone, as if the heavens themselves were bracing for the storm to break. The drive to the ferry terminal was silent, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of police radios in the distance. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead, her mind racing not with fear, but with resolve. This was no longer about her reputation or her position. It was about the future, the integrity of justice, the protection of those too often left voiceless. As they approached the terminal, its silhouette stark against the rising moon, Eleanor's phone buzzed again. A text message. No name, just words they're coming. You have 10 minutes. Move. Her heart hammered once in her chest, but her grip on the door handle tightened. Marcus, she said sharply. Park by the loading dock. Leave the engine running. As he pulled in, she spotted a group of shadowy figures approaching from the far end of the lot. Officers, plainclothes agents, it was hard to tell. But the intent was clear. Eleanor stepped out of the car, briefcase in hand, and made her way briskly toward the terminal's entrance. Keene was already there, flanked by 2 agents in dark suits. We need to move. Now, Keene said, without preamble, her voice low but urgent. Eleanor nodded, stepping into the terminal just as the first of the approaching figures shouted after her, Judge Pierce, stop right there. She didn't turn. Instead, she stepped through the sliding doors into the shadows beyond the storm, breaking overhead with a sharp crack of thunder. Behind her, the shouts rose into a crescendo, but she didn't look back. The gathering storm had begun, and Eleanor Pierce was no longer just a judge. She was the lightning rod. Rain lashed against the windows of the safe house, each droplet drumming a steady, relentless beat, echoing the pulse racing in Eleanor Pierce's veins. Inside, the air was thick with urgency. The safe house was no grand refuge, just a nondescript brick building on the outskirts of Savannah, its halls humming with the low murmur of federal agents moving with quiet purpose. The storm outside mirrored the gathering storm within these walls. Keene stood near the doorway, her posture tense but composed. The digital transfers are complete, she said, glancing at her tablet. We've duplicated every file, every record. It's already on a secure server outside state jurisdiction. Even if they pull a full sweep, they won't erase this truth. Eleanor sat on a plain wooden chair, the weight of exhaustion settling on her shoulders. She had shed the polished exterior of Judge Pierce hours ago, leaving behind the ceremonial black robes, the layers of practiced formality. Here she was, just a woman who had witnessed the system's mask fall away and reveal its rot. A sharp knock echoed through the room. Marcus stepped in, water dripping from his coat. They're here, he said quietly. The press, protesters, half the city it feels like. Word's out, and it's spreading fast. They know you're here. Eleanor's breath hitched her mind, flashing through images of people gathering outside faces. She didn't know. Voices raised, not in anger, but in hope. These were the same people who had once walked past injustice, who had averted their eyes from quiet abuses. Now they were standing still, refusing to be ignored. Keen met her gaze. They need to hear from you. You're the one who can make them see. This isn't just about you. It's about all of them. Eleanor rose, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. If I go out there, they'll try to silence me, she murmured. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low but unwavering. Then make it impossible for them to succeed. The decision was already made. She grabbed the briefcase, the same one that had held sealed files, testimonies, whispers of conspiracy, and stepped toward the door. Marcus handed her an umbrella, but she shook her head. Let them see me. Together, they stepped into the storm. Outside, the rain came down in sheets, blurring the faces of those who had gathered. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder with reporters, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for accountability. Camera flashes punctuated the downpour, each burst of light illuminating Eleanor's face as she emerged from the shadows. She raised her hand, not to quiet the crowd, but to invite them closer. Keen and Marcus flanked her, but she was the one who stepped forward, her voice carrying over the storm. I know why you're here. She began her words steady, despite the thunder that rumbled overhead. You've heard the whispers, you've seen the headlines, but this is more than one woman's fight. This is about a system built to protect power, a system that believes it can silence dissent with threats, with force, with fear. A hush fell over the crowd, the only sound the rain hammering against umbrellas and raincoats. I was arrested, not because I broke the law, but because I refused to let them break me, she continued, her voice rising. I stood my ground because too many have been forced to step aside, because justice doesn't come from silence, it comes from truth. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, We're with you. Judge Pierce. Eleanor's throat tightened, but she pressed on. This isn't just my story. It's yours. It's every family who lost a loved one to a system that looked the other way. It's every voice silenced behind closed doors. Today we stop whispering. Today we make noise loud enough to shatter the walls of corruption. The crowd surged, voices rising in agreement. Protesters lifted signs higher, their slogans no longer obscured by the rain. Justice for all, someone shouted. No more silence, another cried. Keen leaned in. They're moving. The police are mobilizing. They'll try to disperse the crowd. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she stood taller. Then they'll see what happens when silence becomes a roar. A line of uniformed officers appeared at the edges of the gathering, their presence a stark contrast to the defiance in the crowd. But the protesters didn't scatter. Instead, they closed ranks, shielding Eleanor and her team, their bodies forming a human barricade. Eleanor's voice rang out once more. I have already given my testimony to federal agents. I have already sent the files to safe hands. You cannot erase the truth. She turned to the officers, her gaze fierce. You think you can arrest your way out of this? You think you can silence an entire city? A murmur rippled through the line of police, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Some lowered their batons. Others shifted uneasily, glancing at each other as if questioning the orders that had brought them here. Keen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then at Eleanor. We've just received confirmation. Federal oversight is being enacted. The files have been delivered to the Department of Justice. Indictments are being prepared. Eleanor exhaled the weight of the storm, lifting just slightly. It's starting. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices carrying across the rain-slicked streets. Camera flashes illuminated the scene, capturing the moment when a city decided to stand with one voice against the silence that had reigned for too long. But even as the crowd celebrated, Eleanor knew the battle was far from over. The reckoning had begun. But it would take more than one night, more than one storm, to wash away the years of complicity and corruption. As the rain continued to fall, she stood in the center of it all, a steady figure in the chaos, a living reminder that justice wasn't a whisper, but a reckoning in the rain. The morning light crept through the rain-slicked windows of the courthouse, painting the marble floors with streaks of gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city heavy with the weight of what had been revealed and the unsteady hope of what might come next. Inside, Eleanor Pierce sat alone in the judge's chambers, her reflection fractured in the polished surface of the mahogany desk before her. For a moment, she allowed herself the quiet, the silence. It was a fragile thing, a silence no longer born from fear or complicity, but from exhaustion and reflection. The roar of the crowd the night before, the faces that had turned toward her, the weight of the files that had passed from her hands to the federal agents, they all lingered in her mind like echoes. The door opened quietly, and Marcus entered his face, tired but determined. He held a steaming mug of coffee, which he placed in front of her without a word. She nodded her thanks, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the warmth. "We've had confirmation," he said softly, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile calm. "Indictments have been filed. They're moving on Boone, on Ramsey, on Halcroft. The mayor's office is under federal investigation. The press conference is set for noon. Keene says they want you to speak." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not as a judge," she murmured. "No," Marcus agreed, "as the woman who refused to let them bury the truth." She glanced at the window, where the dawn painted the sky with streaks of pink and gold. The city beyond was waking up, but it wasn't the same city it had been just days ago. It was raw, exposed, uncertain. But for the first time in years, perhaps decades, it was also honest. "I'm tired," Eleanor admitted, her voice cracking. "I know," Marcus replied gently, "but you're not finished yet." She stood slowly, her joints aching with the weight of sleepless nights and the tension of a battle fought too long and too quietly. She moved toward the window, her gaze tracing the skyline where the sun was beginning to rise, burning away the remnants of the storm. Outside, the city was already stirring. Reporters set up their cameras, their microphones poised for statements. Protesters gathered, some holding signs weathered from last night's rain. Others knew, their words painted in bold, defiant strokes. Amid the chaos, a quiet resolve pulsed through the crowd, a belief that change was not only possible, but inevitable. Eleanor turned back to Marcus. "They're going to try to rebuild, to spin this, to bury it again." "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "But not this time. Too many people are watching. Too many voices are rising. And you," he hesitated, then continued, "you've given them a reason to believe." She inhaled deeply, straightening her shoulders. "Then let's finish this." Together, they stepped out of the chambers and into the corridors of the courthouse. The marble echoed beneath their footsteps, each step carrying the weight of countless stories of injustice, silence, and now reckoning. The air buzzed with anticipation, with the quiet murmurs of those who had come not just to hear words, but to witness a turning point. Eleanor stepped onto the courthouse steps as the sun crested the horizon, flooding the plaza with light. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled, and the crowd parted like a wave making way for her. She stood there, not behind the shield of a bench, not in the shadow of an institution, but as a citizen among citizens. She raised her voice, not in anger, but with the steady, resonant clarity of truth. This city has carried the weight of silence for too long. Today we choose something different. Today we choose to stand in the light. A ripple passed through the crowd, a murmur of agreement that built into applause. We are not here to destroy, but to rebuild, to demand accountability, not just for the few who abuse their power, but for the system that allowed it, to ensure that justice is no longer a privilege for some, but a right for all. The cameras caught her words. The microphones carried them beyond the plaza, beyond Savannah, into homes, offices, and hearts across the nation. She paused, letting the silence settle, not with fear, but with finality. This is our dawn, and we will not let it fade. The applause swelled, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor Pierce felt something unfamiliar and precious settle over her hope. Not the fragile, flickering kind, but the kind born from the realization that the world can change, that light can break through even the darkest storms. As the crowd surged forward in solidarity as the city echoed with the beginning of something new, she stepped down from the courthouse steps, not into an uncertain future, but into a dawn she had helped to create. In the end, the story of Eleanor Pierce is not simply about a judge wronged or a corrupt system unmasked. It's a testament to the quiet resilience and profound courage that lie within ordinary people when they are forced to confront extraordinary injustice. Eleanor's journey from a mistaken arrest to a public reckoning revealed layers of corruption and complicity that had festered beneath Savannah's dignified facade for decades. But more importantly, it showcased how one person's unwavering determination, combined with truth and a refusal to be silenced, can ignite a movement that refuses to fade into the background. Eleanor's story is not one of rage-fueled retribution, but of resolute defiance and thoughtful courage. She stood firm, not because she sought revenge, but because she believed in a higher ideal of justice, a justice not doled out selectively, but accessible to all, regardless of race, rank, or reputation. Her refusal to be intimidated, even in the face of threats, smear campaigns, and systemic rot, inspired countless others to find their voice, to challenge entrenched power, and to stand against silence. The arrest that was meant to humiliate her became the spark that lit a fire of accountability across the city and beyond. This story reminds us that the battle for justice isn't fought in grand gestures, but in quiet acts of integrity, in the refusal to look away, in the courage to say, "This is not right," and to back those words with action. In our own lives, this lesson urges us to confront injustice, however uncomfortable, to support those who are marginalized or silenced, and to remember that real change is built one person, one act of truth at a time. Whether it's standing up in our communities, calling out prejudice at work, or simply listening with empathy to those who feel unheard, the responsibility lies with each of us. If this story has moved you, challenged your thinking, or inspired you to look deeper into the systems around you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories that shine a light on truth, challenge injustice, and uplift voices that deserve to be heard. Join us in continuing this vital conversation, because together we can be the spark that lights the dawn.